So when Robert and his colleague Andrew Doran first invited me to address this conference, they asked me to focus on the rise of the post-Christian online right and the temptation felt by many young Christians to throw in their lot with Bronze Age pervert and his band of neo-pagan blowhards and dime store Nietzscheans, a movement characterized above all by the idolatry of race. Now, if you have no idea what Bronze Age pervert is or what any of this refers to, good. It's for the best. I wish I could share your serenity. Be that as it may, my assigned topic suddenly seemed too small and downright inapt in the wake of the events of October 7th. On that day, Hamas infiltrated Israel, as you know, and murdered more than 1,400 people, most of them civilians, many women, children, and elderly. Inspired by Hamas's founding charter, which commits the group not to the building up of a decent Palestinian national home, but to the extermination of Jews, all Jews, terrorists tied up children and forced their parents, were forced to watch their parents being tortured, or in other cases, they started with the kids and forced the parents to behold the unspeakable. Babies were beheaded, others ripped out of their mothers' wombs. Many world leaders, including to their credit, American leaders of both parties, condemned the attack. But not everyone agreed. Some took to the streets, including in my city, New York, to celebrate the atrocities as courageous acts of resistance. Student groups at elite universities issued statements placing the sole blame for the assault on the Jewish state. Franciscan University, it must be noted, was a notable exception to this dismal trend. In a magnificent gesture worthy of its namesake, Franciscan offered to host Jewish students at other schools who now no doubt feel utterly alienated from their institutions and fellow students. In the event, the confrontation with the racist online right, odious and dangerous as it is, would have to be postponed. At this moment, a moment of peril for the state of Israel and the Jewish people worldwide, and at a Catholic Jewish conference celebrating Nostra Aetate, the Church's declaration on its relations with non-Christian faiths, something else was called for, is called for. It isn't enough merely to repudiate classical anti-Judaism, according to which the Jews persist as a leftover people, their abject condition serving as a half-living negative monument to the high price of their stiff-necked obduracy. Nor does it suffice to merely reject modern racialized anti-Semitism, an affront to basic human decency that culminated in the Holocaust and to this day endangers Jewish communities while disfiguring the souls and intellects of the anti-Semites themselves. Nor, finally, should we rest content with opposing anti-Semitism in its so-called anti-Zionist guise, which singles out one country, and only one country, for obsessive criticism and efforts at delegitimation. What is called for, in short, isn't merely a negative posture with respect to those tendencies, appalling though they are. Rather, what the October 7th moment demands from us Catholics is a positive expression of friendship for the Jewish people, sons and daughters of Abraham after the flesh. What is called for is love, the love that radiates from the gospel and from the heart of the church, but which has too often been obscured by sinful individual Christians in their dealings with Jews over the course of too long millennia. So that is what I propose to do today, to give a personal expression to a Catholic love of Israel after the flesh as a son of the church, and I should add, a son of the Middle East. Yet in order for this love to be worthy of the intelligence of our Jewish friends, it has to take the measure of the very real theological and philosophical barrier that divides us, what makes it so that Israel after the flesh and Israel after the spirit aren't identical communities, notwithstanding a great deal of overlap between the two. What Jacques Maritain called the mystery of Israel, the mystery of Israel's persistence as people of the old but not the new covenant, their indomitable insistence on Jewish particularity over and against the universal claims of the Church has been both the source of legitimate theological disputation as well as a wellspring of illegitimate anti-Jewish feeling on the part of too many Christians through the ages, right down to our own time. One modern response to this discomfiting reality on the part of both well-intentioned Catholics and understandably defensive Jews has been to sidestep the thorny mystery altogether. Instead, they have mounted a common Judeo-Christian front against the secularism and relativism that menace both communities. Now, it isn't my intention to question the legitimacy of the label Judeo-Christian, as some on both sides of the divide do. On the contrary, as a historical matter, there is no better way to refer to certain religious communities in Mesopotamia and elsewhere in the Middle East in the early Christian era that believed that a Christ event had taken place, whether centered on Jesus of Nazareth or John the Baptist, and at the same time continue to uphold ablutions and dietary restrictions and other so-called cultic commandments of the Torah, often as a matter of local custom. And in our time, there is without a doubt a Judeo-Christian sensibility underpinned by the moral law that mobilizes small o Orthodox Catholics and Christians and capital O Orthodox Jews and other Jews in a shared cause against gender ideology, say, or the horrors of unrestrained biotechnology. But I do wonder if the comforts of Judeo-Christianity, insofar as they permit both camps to sidestep the discomfiting mystery of Israel, prevent us from achieving the sort of dispassionate understanding that Maritain considered essential to overcoming Christian anti-Semitism, and more than that, making more supple and bearable the divide between the two communities. Is it possible for Catholics, and here I address myself explicitly to my fellow Catholics, not pretending that I can ever stand coolly apart from the divide or strike a neutral pose, is it possible for us to deepen our love for Israel precisely by delineating where the differences lie? Could it be that in our relations with the Jewish people, we can become a more loving community, more fully Christian, by delving into the mystery, not daring to imagine we can solve it with just the right arguments, and this will be a constant theme in this talk. It wouldn't be a mystery if that were feasible, but seeking to illuminate its contours, especially the tension between Jewish particularism and Catholic universalism. And if we set out to do so, would it not behoove us to borrow some light from the Jewish sages, rather than merely speak from within our own tradition to ourselves? So that is what I propose to do today, offering not detailed arguments, much less definitive answers, but a few general themes that might be taken up by smarter and more learned scholars in the room. Maritain thought that the mystery of Israel is a profound supernatural problem without solution. True, but it's also the stuff of ordinary discourse between Catholics and Jews, at least in those unguarded moments when we permit ourselves to be honest. In early 2017, soon after I was received into the church in London, I met up with an older Jewish friend, an alumnus of the Bush administration. He and I had planned to co-author a book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict together, but we had struggled to nail down a proposal, and I eventually exited the project to pursue others. Still, when we caught up in London, he greeted me warmly and congratulated me on my becoming Catholic. But you know something, he added? There's one thing missing from your New Testament that we have lots of in our Hebrew Bible. Do you know what that is? Go on, I replied. A sense of humor. Your Jesus and his disciples, I have to say, are entirely lacking in humor. Not so with the Old Testament. Just go to the part in Exodus where the Israelites get fed up with following Moses around Sinai. Hungry, thirsty, fed up with the prophet, they say to him, and here my friend affected a voice roughly recalling, Jeff's wife addressing Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm, which I won't imitate, like, Moses, were there not enough graves back in Egypt that you had to have us schlep all the way into the desert? At least over there, they gave us cucumbers, they gave us vegetables. What is it that you've had us do, Moses? Were there not enough graves in Egypt? My friend added, now that is a distinctly Jewish voice, a Jewish sense of humor still resounding from the Torah 3,000 years later. As a secular Jew, I can't read that passage without detecting something in it that is distinctly of my people. I wish I had asked him to give me more examples of Old Testament humor. That aside, I intuitively grasped his point as an Iranian who remains indelibly marked by my homeland, the one I left behind more than 2 decades ago and haven't returned to since. Something that is distinctly of my people. Another friend, an Israeli-American, put things more bluntly when he visited London soon after my conversion. Listen, I love Catholics. My parents were secular Jews, so they had no trouble enrolling me in Catholic school when I was growing up, and I loved it. I learned so much. The spirit of Catholic education is something truly special. But I have to say, look, you guys are trying to impose your lofty, rational Greek God on our desert God, our hilltop God, our angry bush God. And you know, it just doesn't work for me. I mention these two anecdotes because they attest to the depth of the divide between Jewish particularity and the universalism of the church. Indeed, as my two friends' remarks suggest, the divide can run all the way down to the level of epistemology, to what can be known about God and morality and how, more importantly, how we come to know it. For Catholics, the West, if that infamously loosey-goosey designation still has any meaning, is the product of an encounter and eventual synthesis between reason and revelation in antiquity, two ways of knowing the world. The encounter was occasioned by war, the Alexandrian conquest of the East. Nevertheless, it gave rise to an authentic synthesis between a Greek rationality in search of the deepest origins of reality and a Jewish God professed to be just that, the very ground of being, the I am of Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Later, that same God identified himself even more starkly and intimately with reason. In the beginning was Logos, reason, and reason was with God, and reason was God. Tragically, the Catholic story goes on, this synthesis eventually lost its primacy in the West, owing foremost to opponents inside the church determined to distill a purer faith, unmodeled by worldly philosophy. The result was a stingy account of reason that excluded things divine. We now find ourselves torn between either a narrowly scientistic rationality or a fundamentalist or biblicist religion. On the menu at the restaurant of modernity, you can either pick reason without faith or unreasonable faith. The late Pope Benedict XVI, in his much misunderstood Regensburg address, gave one account of this tragedy, the tragedy of de-Hellenization. But note that what he considered a tragedy is predicated on an earlier providential triumph, how the Alexandrian conquest brought Jewish monotheism into dialogue with philosophy, notwithstanding, quote, the bitter conflict with those Hellenistic rulers who sought to accommodate Judaism forcibly to the customs and idolatrous cult of the Greeks, as Benedict granted. Needless to say, the Jewish tradition hasn't, in the main, read these events in the same light. Providence was at work all right, in the Seleucid subjection of the Holy Land. Its purpose to awaken the people of God once more to the abominations of idolatry and the imperative to cleanse the body of Israel from defilement by foreign idols, as Judah Maccabee indeed did. The Maccabean revolt, the historian of Judaism Martin Goodman tells us, is, quote, the only known case of the adherents of an Eastern religion opposing by force the encroachment of Greek culture in their native land. Other native cults in the region around Judea lost their distinctive characteristics as they were reinterpreted in Greek fashion. But the Jews did not lose their cult. My own people were Hellenized quite literally in the bedroom, with when Alexander, after routing the Achaemenid dynasty, had 10,000 of his troops marry Iranian women in a ceremony at Susa. It would take several centuries for the Iranians to constitute their ancestral religion, which came to be known as Zoroastrianism, into an orthodoxy, mainly as a reaction to the conquest. You know, sometimes I think we're in an age of ever more exotic grievances, and I feel like the Greek government owes me. Or maybe it's Macedonia. But I remember. It was 2,500 years ago, but I don't never forgive. The point is that de-Hellenization is no skin off the back of the Jewish tradition. The God of the Hebrew Bible, the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks believed, was never the God of the Academy to begin with. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is neither the unmoved mover nor the ground of being, but a historical God who has put himself into dialogue and relationship with one people, the Jews. More than that, who has entered into a covenant with Abraham after the flesh. He is a universal creator, yes, but little about him could be deduced by processes of reason. He is best known, rather, through the moral revolution heralded by Abrahamic faith. For Rabbi Sacks, the epistemic divide even had a linguistic dimension. The God of the Bible, he contended, was lost in the bargain of Paul's ambition to spread his new faith in the Greco-Roman sphere. God was lost in translation. The Greek language, with its left-to-right script, per Sacks, tends towards abstraction and universalization, whereas Hebrew is a fundamentally right-brained language, he said, tending toward narrative and particularity. The result was that the West received an abstract theoretical version of a supremely narrativistic deity. When I read that passage in Exodus, I hear something that is distinctly of my people, to echo my friend once more. Sacks denied nearly all natural theology and classical metaphysics. In his 2011 book, a masterpiece, The Great Partnership, Science, Religion, and the Search for Meaning, he declared, "We cannot prove that life is meaningful and that God exists. Neither can we prove that love is better than hate, altruism than selfishness, forgiveness than the desire for revenge," end quote. All of these statements, he said, are a matter of interpretation rather than of explanation, and all interpretations are beyond proof or falsification. The quest for ultimate meaning, he argued, falls into the same territory as ethics, aesthetics, and metaphysics, and in none of these three disciplines can anything of consequence be proved, end quote. Ethics, aesthetics, and metaphysics are great repositories of human wisdom, he granted, but they simply don't belong in the same universe of discourse as science. Thus, when pre-modern science, quote unquote, was debunked, all that was lost was the false certainty of the Christian scholar who imagined himself confidently blending reason and revelation, Aristotle and the Lord. The synthesis, the attempt to Hellenize the Bible and the teachings of Jesus, was an imposition on Sacks's view. And it was precisely because the God of the philosophers was so distant and inaccessible, he thought, that the early church had to posit a God-man as man's bridge to God. Now, it's probably worth pausing here for a caveat. The Jewish response to the Catholic synthesis of faith and reason is as variegated and complex as 2 millennia of Christian-Jewish intellectual encounter. Plenty of Jewish sages, not least Maimonides, have engaged classical metaphysics productively, bearing fruit for all people of faith. I dare not suggest that I can begin to summarize this intellectual history. Nevertheless, it is safe to venture that Lord Sacks spoke from well within the Jewish tradition on this point. Michael Wyszogrod, also a Jewish thinker who, like Sacks, was profoundly sensitive to the Christian message and solicitous for Christian-Jewish friendship, nevertheless lamented that Christianity's deep involvement with Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy has generated, quote, myriad problems. The Christian need to universalize Israel's election, shifting divine election from flesh to faith, forced the Catholic religion to rely ever more on philosophy to supply it with universal structures, as Wyszogrod said. Quote, "For this reason, the Christian mind was driven to an ever greater concern with philosophy, a tendency that, while not totally absent in the history of Judaism, never reaches the same proportions it does in Christianity," end quote. Still, a different sage, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, one of the founding fathers of modern Orthodox Judaism, would grant classical philosophy a great deal more, even as he associated natural law with what he called humankind's cosmic impulse, our yearning to subdue the natural world, subduing it by knowing it, and thus bringing about the interpenetration of subject and object. Here, Sacks and Soloveitchik diverged somewhat. The latter accepted the Aristotelian notion of interpenetration between subject and object, knower and known. If the subject can know, and thus in a sense become the object through the exercise of his intellect, Soloveitchik argued, then earthbound man can know the cosmos and therefore become a, quote, cosmic citizen. For the Rav, as he was known, to be clear, this cosmic yearning was perfectly legitimate. Indeed, in it echoed the biblical injunction to subdue the earth, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. If the Jews hadn't participated in the cosmic quest for many centuries, up until the dawn of modernity and Napoleonic emancipation, this wasn't by their choice. It owed rather to the small-minded bigotry that treated Israel like a, quote, subhuman object. For a long time, the Jews weren't considered subjects worthy of contributing to the cosmic quest. And here, even the sternest critic of liberalism and modern notions of progress must tip his hat to liberal modernity for doing what the medieval world, for all its other virtues, was incapable of doing, indeed refused to do, namely to invite the Jews to join the cosmic quest alongside non-Jews. As Maritain put it, in one of the most beautiful philo-Semitic statements ever penned by a Catholic writer, published in book form in 1941, think about that year, emancipation allowed Jews to exercise their gifts for stimulating and advancing history to the great benefit of our whole species. We will return to this notion of a Jewish gift for energizing the temporal order much, much later. What matters for our purposes at this juncture is the Rav's acceptance of the legitimacy of the cosmic quest and of cosmic man. But, and this is a very important but, on the question of morality, Soloveitchik turned from celebrating cosmic man to chastising him. Here, he insisted, the Jewish tradition raises up a fence beyond which cosmic man mustn't venture. In the opinion of cosmic man, he wrote, morality must be intelligible and rational, appealing to the conscience and to the mind. That is to say, cosmic man expects to find the same legible patterns in the moral realm as he does elsewhere, patterns he thinks he can map and therefore master like any other cosmic object. Forgive me. Quote, philosophical ethics beginning with Plato and Aristotle, he wrote, is victory-minded and success-oriented. Man sets himself up as the king and strives to triumph over opposition and hostility. Judaism, however, knows that the kingship victory morality is not always adequate. Sometimes God commands us not to eat certain kinds of fish, and that is that. Through the ages, countless attempts have been made to explain away the Torah's cultic as opposed to moral commandments by way of reference, for example, to hygienic considerations and so on. Yet as Goodman, the historian of Judaism, tells us, none of these attempts have by and large failed. The commandments, the hukim, or ahkam, as we would say in Persian and Arabic, are what they are. Wrote Rabbi Soloveitchik, acceptance of hukim, statutes which the Logos cannot comprehend, is alien to the philosophy of cosmic man. There can be and has been plenty of disputation about the application and meaning and implications of the commandments in the Jewish tradition, but they finally can't be reduced to universal moral laws naturally legible to the human mind, though certainly the moral ones enshrined in the Ten Commandments can be articulated that way. The implications of this for Catholic thinking about the mystery of Israel should be obvious. The argument isn't just between Aristotle and the Rav, let's say. It also implicates Christians and Jews as two distinct religious communities that claim the same revealed text. As the late Rabbi Jacob Neusner, whom Pope Benedict repeatedly and rightly praised as a path-breaking figure in interfaith dialogue, noted, it wasn't just the classical tradition that insisted on the legibility and on meaning when it came to morality. Historic Christianity did the same thing in its own way. Neusner might agree with the Christian belief, for example, that the Torah's dietary restrictions point humankind to interior purity, purity in what we think, desire, and say, see Matthew chapter 15, verse 11. Sure, he granted, we should strive for interior purity. Even so, the dietary commandments and the entire body of the Torah's cultic hukim finally are what they are, revealed once and for all by God at Sinai, and more than that, more than always pointing to some deeper moral principle, they define a social order, an order flowing from Abraham's seed, something, as my friend said years ago again, distinctly of my people. The question of community or social order brings us to the political dimension of this antinomy between Jewish particularity and Catholic universality. And that is, again, the political dimension. I won't dwell on this one for long, in part because it's rather obvious, and in part because I've written about it at length in First Things, in an essay you can find under the headline Apostolic Empire. The upshot is that the fundamental political form of the Catholic faith is imperial. Now, when we use the word imperial, it can immediately conjure negative associations, like Nero or 19th century European imperialism. But try, if you can, to prescind these mental associations. Set aside, too, the question of the form of government, which is a separate issue. Rather, think strictly about the scope of the political community and of political belonging. In respect, at least to Catholic Christianity, this problem has to be addressed from a historical standpoint, drawing on a record that straddles both the New Testament and secular historiography. Surveying Christian salvation history, we can see that just as there was a providential synthesis between Greek philosophy and Judeo-Christian revelation in the realm of ideas, so there was a natural kinship between the legal and political practice of Rome and that of the nascent church. The result was that, notwithstanding the violence meted out by Rome to Christians in the age before Constantine, the church came to assume Roman political form. The essence of this unlikely congruity is universalism, beginning with Rome's drive to subject all nations to its own mode of governing rationality. The Romans built reliable roads linking their vast domains, and down these roads they spread the same legally ordered way of being in the world, whether their subject peoples liked it or not. These were the essential material conditions, said the church historian Henri Daniel Ropp, without which early Christianity couldn't have flourished. But more than mere material conditions, Roman reality structured the Christian mind and lent it the same universalist impulse. While Roman universalism still appears far inferior to Christian universalism, observed Daniel Ropp, it must nevertheless have been useful to the introduction to the latter. As an introduction, apologies, to the latter. Christianity could have emerged as a religion of isolated inland places, but it didn't take that shape. It was a religion of polyglot ports and city-states under the administration of a multinational, multi-ethnic empire. Administration itself wasn't alien to the church. It came naturally as a result of this. As soon as it needed to provide itself with administration, wrote Daniel Ropp, it borrowed its ideas on the subject from the imperium, not least the office of Pontifex Maximus. The natural and indeed the Torah-ordained Jewish political form is obviously the nation. The nation and peoplehood are loci of Jewish social order. The mystical body of Israel, wrote Maritain, is that of a specific people. Its basis is temporal and involves a community of flesh and blood. To be sure, Maritain granted, the experience of dispersion, which began before the Christian era, did lend a universal character to the Jewish experience, but this was a tragic universality, and every single prayer in exile hummed with yearning for Jerusalem and for Zion, for the Jewish homestead. All of this is to say that when we speak of the mystery of Israel, it isn't just a matter of assent or a failure to give assent to Jesus as the Messiah or as the second person of the Most Holy Trinity, beliefs that raise even hairier theological problems for our Jewish brothers and sisters. It's also about two distinct religious communities with different ways of being in the world: epistemic, philosophical, moral, political, to summarize our discussion so far. As a result of divergent religious developments and historical experiences, these two different modes of being in the world emerge side by side often, but nevertheless separate. Now, at this point, I imagine Andrew is thinking, wow, thanks, Sohrab. We invited you to address a Catholic-Jewish dialogue, and here you go outlining how deep the differences lie. But that is precisely my point. As I said at the outset, at the level of the two communities, I don't think these differences can be overcome by just the right philosophical or theological argument. In the wake of Nostra Aetate, Rabbi Soloveitchik went so far as to discourage dialogue on these kinds of issues, insisting that the two faiths should meet each other solely on the temporal or secular plane, that is, working together to solve shared temporal problems. They could have, of course, brought their moral worldview to that process, but nevertheless, what was at issue was not to be anything but temporal questions. Closer to our time, however, figures like Visegrad and Neusner did engage in such dialogue, serving both communities by both delineating differences and seeking as much common ground as their Jewish commitments would permit. In 1993, Neusner published a wonderful book titled A Rabbi Talks with Jesus. In it, the author probed not those elements of the Christian religion that could be accessed only through the gift of faith, such as the incarnation, but rather those that implicate the two camps' common text, namely the Torah. Does Jesus of Nazareth, as we encounter him in Matthew, the text Neusner specifically picked out, merely fulfill the Torah, as he promises to do, or does he stray from it to a degree that a Torah-observant Jew cannot abide? Neusner concluded that while Jesus' Torah teaching is correct and downright sublime in many places, his dispensing of the cultic commandments undermines Israel, again, as a social order, as an enduring society in sanctification, end quote. Addressing Jesus directly, Neusner says, is everything in your Torah's fulfillment, he says, small t Torah's fulfillment of the Torah, to speak only of my conduct as one person? Is there no Torah for me as part of a family, as part of that Israel that existed before Sinai and assembled at the foot of Sinai? Children of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jason and Leah and Rachel. I am of the family of Israel. What have you to say to me in that family? Now, those of you who are students like me of Pope Benedict's Jesus of Nazareth will know that the late pontiff engaged extensively with Neusner's book, responding to the rabbi's concern with equal magnanimity and gentleness. I find persuasive the Pope's counters, which I needn't restate here. Then again, I happen to be Catholic. The point for our purposes is this: those arguments are fine, more than fine. They're indispensable to the mind of the Church and worthy of the intelligence of our Jewish brothers and sisters. And no doubt, such arguments occasionally win over individuals, I should say in both directions perhaps. And here's the crux of my proposal. If we only approach the Jewish community with an eye toward winning, with argument and polemic, no matter how well thought out the argument, or how gentle the polemical touch, we risk missing what the Lord may be telling us through the gift of Israel after the flesh, and by deigning to put the two communities in the relationship in which they find themselves, whether we like it or not, including in all those intractable differences I just enumerated. Wrote Maritain at the height of Europe's anti-Semitic frenzy, Israel is itself throughout time a living and indestructible depository of the promises of God. Let me read that one more time, because I've meditated on this single sentence over and over for hours, now poking at it for signs of failure of Catholic orthodoxy and failing, now admiring its construction as a piece of prose, and now getting goosebumps at its unassailable truth. Quote, Israel is itself throughout time a living and indestructible depository of the promises of God. The persistence against all odds of the body of Israel, and here I insist on the double meaning of that phrase, the body of Israel as both a community and a physical reality of flesh and blood, must have a meaning for Catholics that transcends differences over the Torah or over the scope of natural reason, and so on, profound and real as those differences are. That the people of Israel that the body of Israel persists against all odds seems to be telling us something. What, we should ask ourselves, does that consist of? Here, I can only venture the roughest outline. For starters, the body of Israel, this living and indestructible depository of divine love, is a reminder of the incarnational nature of our own faith. Judaism, Walker Percy once wrote, is offensive to the soulless scientific spirit of our age, quote, because it claims that God entered into a covenant with a single tribe and no other. By the same token, Christianity offends our age, he said, quote, because it claims not only this, but also that God became one man, he and no other, end quote. Now, a pap and, dare I say, rather stupid answer to this line of thinking would be to point out that Israel accepts the first, but not the second of these two propositions of faith. But it isn't as simple as that. While Judaism, of course, rejects the notion that God became man in Jesus Christ, the Hebrew Bible time and again speaks of God in anthropomorphic terms. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back. This, for Wishograd, was no accident. Quote, the indwelling of God in the tabernacle, in the temple of Jerusalem, and in the Jewish people, in these things, he wrote, quote, I detect a certain diluted incarnation. Expounding on 1 Kings chapter 8, he wrote, God dwells in the temple, even if he is also greater than anything a building can encompass. But the transcendence of God is not what's newsworthy in that passage. What is newsworthy, quote, is that God dwelled in the tabernacle, in the tent of meeting, and now dwells in the temple built by Solomon. God has taken residence among the people of Israel. That is what makes the space and its environs, Jerusalem and Israel, in which he dwells holy, and it makes the people among whom he dwells likewise holy, end quote. A Christian might take this further, asserting that God's dwelling among Israel prefigured the incarnation of Jesus Christ, a claim that, needless to say, is more than Wishograd's diffuse incarnation can bear. But for our purposes, what matters is that the Most High dwelled in a special way in one land, and not any of the others, among one people, in one people. Could it be the case that following the incarnation, the earlier indwelling could have no special significance for Catholics, that it would lose its meaning? That Israel's various landmarks, and I mean Israel as a country, can't mean much to us because, after all, we can immediately encounter the incarnated God in the Eucharist anytime, almost anywhere in the world? I strongly disagree. Otherwise, God forbid, why shouldn't we propose that the old city of Jerusalem be replaced with a giant Walmart? No, this land and this people, and the connection between the two, are pregnant with meaning for Catholics. And again, I insist on the physical aspect of pregnancy as well as the figurative one. The literal and physical as well as the figurative one. It follows, second, that opposing anti-Semitism should be a matter of honor for us Catholics. God dwelt in this land, among this people, in this people, on that mount. And if that weren't enough to rouse our honor against Jew hatred, add the fact that we believe that God dwelt, and going back to the theme of pregnancy, quite literally in a Jewish womb. As Maritain said, it is no small thing for a Christian to hate or to despise, or to wish to treat in a debasing way the race whence issued his God and the immaculate mother of his God, end quote. The physicality of the body of Israel, moreover, is likewise a potent antidote to various Gnostic temptations. Mary's Jewish body is the touchstone of our orthodoxy, without which Christianity can too easily transform into a too otherworldly faith, as indeed it did in various heresies of the late antique period. Plus, the fidelity of the body of Israel to Scripture, whatever our disagreements over the law and much else, is a bulwark against antinomian tendencies. Perhaps the first ideological anti-Semite, it should be recalled, was the heresiarch Marcion, who compiled the first biblical canon and along the way excised the entire Hebrew Bible, and with it much of the New Testament, I should add. He was motivated by the view that the God of the Hebrew Bible, capricious and vengeful as he saw him, couldn't be the same God of the New Testament, a view with some currency today in certain Christian circles. But in response, the church, the historic church, offered its own canon, very much including the texts venerated by the body of Israel. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in the wake of October 7th, the body of Israel imposes on us a duty of Jewish safety, including and especially in the modern state of Israel. The nation state may not come naturally to the Catholic faith, as I suggested, but for so long as the world is divided into nation states, it is obscene to deny one people, and only one people, the safety they demand and deserve in their historic homeland. Not for apocalyptic reasons, not for Protestant dispensationalism, not for nationalistic or chauvinistic zeal, the body of Israel's yearning for its homeland, where the Most High dwelt, among whom the Most High dwelt, after centuries of mistreatment, we Christians must admit that that place must be safe, so that they may continue to contribute as magnificently as they have to the cosmic quest, as an equal nation among the nations, rather than a ghettoized and humiliated subaltern body. We Christians are not Israelites after the flesh. Nevertheless, our faith and our reason compel us to join this other mystic body in insisting, not merely as a slogan, but a concrete demand that the people of Israel live, the people of Israel must live. Am Israel Chai. Thank you very much.